Amazing. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you all here with us for the launch of Medact's newest briefing, Unhealthy Liaisons, NHS Collaboration with the Counter Terrorism Clinical Consultancy Service, or CTCCS. If you're joining us online, please do say hi in the chat. We'd love for you to put down like your name, where you're based, and a line about what brought you here. Like, we really welcome you. My name's Sarah. I'm Peace and Security Campaigner at Medact. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll be guiding us through tonight's launch. Firstly, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Medact's work, we are a UK-based charity for global health, and we work on a range of issues related to peace and security, but also climate justice, economic justice, and human rights. And as a public health campaigning organization, Medact exists to support health workers and the broader health community to take action towards health justice. So you can support our work by joining Medact as a member, or joining one of our many issue-focused groups, or also checking out if there's a Medact local group in your region, wherever you are. So yeah, tonight, this evening, is a launch event for our newest briefing, Unhealthy Liaisons, which is now available to download online. People in the room, you'll have physical copies in person. But yeah, it's been written by Medact member and Professor of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick, Charlotte Heath-Kelly. And tonight we're going to outline the key findings of the briefing before opening up to a broader panel discussion with 4 speakers who have very generously joined us. So we have Dr. Layla Etelhaj, who is the Director and Senior Caseworker at Prevent Watch, an NGO that supports individuals who have been impacted by the Prevent duty. We've got Dr. Tariq Yunus, who is the Racial Justice Researcher at Healing Justice London, and also Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Middlesex University. Nina Naveed is the Racial Justice Campaigner at Amnesty International UK, and she focuses on counter-terrorism policing and supporting activists to take anti-racist action. Hopefully, we'll also be joined by Jim Killock, who's the Executive Director at Open Rights Group, but we shall see. Jim is yet to join us this evening, so hopefully he'll be en route right now. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. I'll speed through this, but feel free, for those joining us online, to have your cameras on or off, but please stay muted throughout the event as it's being recorded, and it'll help us keep the audio really pristine. If you have questions for our speakers when we go through the panel, or if you have any questions for Charlotte on the report itself as well, please do drop them in the chat. If in person, just jot them down on a piece of paper, and we'll have time at the end for like a broader Q&A and discussion. If you have any issues accessing the Zoom, please do just drop TJ a message, who's my Medact colleague who's monitoring the Zoom chat as well. And yeah, just to read out a bit about our safer spaces policy as well. When taking part in Medact activities, whether online or in person, we hope that you also agree to take an active role in creating a respectful, understanding, and kind space. So we don't tolerate any harmful, oppressive, or abusive behavior or language, which I'm sure we won't have any of this evening. But just to say that, and we really welcome your participation, engagement, and attention in those ways. Yeah, I'll now hand over to Professor Charlotte Heath-Kelly for about a 20-minute presentation on the report and briefing itself before we move on to the panel. I'll read out Charlotte's bio so that you can all have it. Dr. Charlotte Heath-Kelly is a Professor of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. She is currently completing a 5-year study funded by the European Commission investigating the different prevention of violent extremism policies used by European nations. So the focus is on the integration of healthcare professionals and pre-crime logics, or their absence, in European counterterrorism. And Professor Heath-Kelly has published 5 books with Manchester University Press and Routledge, and more than 30 peer-reviewed articles in international academic journals. And we're really grateful that she's very generously written this briefing and is joining us for this presentation. So I'll welcome you up, Charlotte. Yeah.
Okay, I am really short, so I'm going to just, no, not that far. Okay, there we go. There we are. Thank you so much for having me today. This has been something I've been working on for a very long time. So it's really good to actually share it with people and to be able to speak about it. I'm very, very grateful for the other panelists coming today to engage with this topic, and to Amnesty for hosting us, but most of all, for Medact, who have been wonderful partners in bringing this to life. That being said, I'm aware there may be a sporting event starting at 8 o'clock. So with no further ado, I'm going to try and get through this within the 20-minute mark. So here we go. Which button will it be? I don't think the clicker works, TJ. There we go. Just needs to be pressed extremely hard. Okay. Right. This is the structure for the presentation today. First, what I did to find out this information and who funds me. You should always ask that question before you listen to anybody. And then who are counterterrorism policing? Why are they interested in people's medical records? How does the CTCSS operate? Does any other country operate a similar system to the CTCSS? Quick answer, no. What oversight is there of the CTCSS? Quick answer, none. And then the recommendations of the report. So, yeah, TJ, you might need to change the slide for me if possible, because the clicker is dead. Yay. So it's funded by the European Research Council, this research. So that is the funder. It's a 5-year project investigating most European countries, but also some outside Europe, just to check if, how different countries are implementing this kind of collaboration. And the methodology for this report was primarily freedom of information requests. There we found out about the second prevent strategy, which we will get to as part of this report. There's not one, there's actually a second one, which is covert. How the CTCSS operates, and then finally the interviews we did with Mike Nelson, who agreed to be named in the report, who is the head of the Vulnerability Support Service at Counterterrorism Policing, and also a senior clinician working at the program. So, first thing you need to know is who are counterterrorism policing. These are not a standard police force. It's not like Special Branch one day immediately turned into counterterrorism policing. There are a few steps in between, but you can think of them as several generations down the line from Special Branch. So counterterrorism policing basically evolved from SO15. SO15 is Counterterrorism Command in London, and that was a direct successor to Special Branch. So these are incredibly specialized police. The UK has a very idiosyncratic intelligence structure. So usually in Europe, your police would also be your intelligence agency. It's not the case in the UK. MI5 is separate. This is why we have counterterrorism policing. MI5 do not have warrants. They can't arrest anybody. So they can do an investigation, but they cannot act. For that, they need counterterrorism policing. It is important that you know this, and how closely they work with MI5, because in a few slides' time, we're going to be talking about how counterterrorism policing are giving information to GPs, giving information to psychologists in order to open up, a transfer of back and forth information sharing. This intelligence can come from MI5. Counterterrorism policing are their partner. So this is a very high level intelligence agency adjacent, which is a term I'm trying to launch, because they're not MI5, but they're also very, very close to MI5. So that being said, why are they interested in people's medical diagnoses? What on earth is their interest in this information? We need to start by outlining there is absolutely no link, nothing between people's medical conditions and their propensity to commit a crime, or particularly a crime of terrorism. So there's no causal link between this information and committing a crime. Conversely, people with mental illnesses or on the neurodiverse spectrum are more likely to be victims of crime than they are to commit a crime. So there's no direct reason why counterterrorism policing should necessarily be interested in this diagnostic information. There is a complex relationship where there's one study out there that shows that you're slightly more likely to be a lone actor if you have a mental illness or neurodiversity compared to if joining a terrorist group. This does not mean that having a autism or a mental illness means you're more likely to become a terrorist, just that there's a slight differential between lone actors and group-based actors. So I need to sort of put that out there because they do rely on this study very heavily to try and justify what they do. So it is there. I can direct you to it. It is one study. So it's a complex picture, but 99% of what you'll find out there shows that there's no link between mental illness, neurodiversity, and terrorism. Why on earth are they interested in that information then? So the context for why the CTCSS came about is that in 2017, there were 5 separate attacks in the UK, and MI5 and Counter Terrorism Policing were aware of most of the people that committed these attacks. The problem were they had downgraded them. So they have a certain number of people who they can actively surveil, and you've got to be quite high up the risk list for them to be dedicating this level of resource to you. If they don't think you're going to commit an act, you go down the level of risk, and you're downgraded as a subject of interest. So they knew of these people, but they weren't actively surveilling them at the time. So they undertook reviews. How did we fail? What went wrong? These reviews are secret, the MI5 reviews and counter-terrorism policing. But Parliament did produce their own version, which is in the open domain, and just has redacted the parts that we can't know. And the conclusions of these reports were, there's no way that police can actively surveil any more people than they currently are. There's no more resources for that. It's already at its furthest extent. So what are we going to do? Into this space, they suggested we need to take the national security information that MI5 hold and counter-terrorism police hold and move it into the public, local frontline services. So your health service, your social care sector, and get them to monitor people effectively in the community and pass information back to us. This is how this program comes about, because effectively there's no more money and there's no more police officers to follow people around 24 hours a day. So there is a much more embedded relationship between the security services, the healthcare sector, the housing sector, and the social care sector. Right, that's the context for how this came about. What is the CTCSS? How does it operate? Okay, we've previously published a report on its vulnerability support hubs, which is what it was previously called. It's had 2 names in the meantime, just to make my life really, really difficult. But for now, we're just going to call it the CTCSS. It launched as a national service in April of this year with a £17 million tender from government. And effectively, it borrows a lot of the structure of the vulnerability support hubs. So you have medics sitting in counter-terrorism policing hubs in London, Manchester, and Birmingham. They're NHS staff. Primarily, it's a consultant psychiatrist, consultant psychologist, and then mental health nurses are in the pod, as they call it, with them. They also have a constable from the counter-terrorism policing who sits with them as well. They have security clearance at the highest level. So they see the information from counter-terrorism policing at a level that we would never see in terms of what the concern is about somebody and what they've been doing online, et cetera, et cetera. So they have an extremely high level of security clearance, but they are NHS employees. Okay. Yes, and yeah, the trusts are in the reports that are operationalizing this. Now, they can deal with anyone who comes to the attention of counter-terrorism policing. Now, this is a wide spectrum of people. This is people who are released from prison who have been convicted of a terrorist offense. This is a very small minority of who they deal with. It covers investigations, so active investigations where police are wondering, is this behavior indicating that someone is going to commit an attack? Or is it a reflection that somebody's mental illness is causing them to behave in unexpected ways? So it covers that. It also covers the pre-crime space of prevent and also PLP. Earlier, I mentioned that there were two prevents. This is a key factor here. PLP is a version of prevent that is run by the Counter Terrorism Policing. The prevent you know about is run by local authorities. And if a person went through to the channel stage, they would be told, you've been referred to prevent, and they would be asked their consent eventually to have a mentor. PLP is run completely in the covert sphere. It's the same principle in that counterterrorism policing will secretly adjust someone's housing, adjust their mental health care, also surveil their mental health care, to nudge them towards, a better life and away from whatever it is they're concerned about. So it is a covert version of prevent that we discovered while doing this research that links up directly with CTCCS. Okay. The CTCCS is now dealing with about 1,200 cases a year across the spectrum of pre-crime, early prevent referrals, all the way through to released TAC offenders. The majority of those cases are at the lower end of the spectrum, but they do deal with the occasional person who's being released into the community after having served some time in prison. Their primary work is to facilitate information transfer between counterterrorism policing and the NHS. They don't just share information, and this is the key point here. If you're a police officer, you don't necessarily understand psychiatry, psychology, or any of the jargon. The CTCCS translates it for them, and they use formulation to do that. That will become important. This is a picture of how the CTCCS engages with prevent and PLP. So effectively, the CTCCS can deal with prevent referrals before they're cleared to go to the local authority for management. So a key point here is anyone you meet, make sure that they know that if they need to make a prevent referral, that they're comfortable that that referral is going to go straight to the intelligence services to be assessed before it ever makes its way out to the local authority. And in the meantime, there can be the CTCCS involvement, accessing medical records and checking on medical compliance. So be aware. Here is a quote from the senior clinician to sort of underline this. When they are obtaining information from the NHS and filtering it and explaining it to the counterterrorism police, you never know that this has happened. They do not ask your consent. You might think that your medical information is confidential, but there are loopholes in the laws that protect that information. And if it is in the public interest to share it with the police, then that sharing could happen. We'll return to question that later. But the direct quote in the report is, we do not rely on consent. So we just put consent to one side. We're not relying on consent because under various guidance, it could be detrimental to the management plan for us to seek consent. It's not practical for us to seek consent. We don't have direct, contact with the individual. So the medics doing the assessment do not meet the individual. They do not ask consent. And they take that information, translate it for the counterterrorism police without ever meeting the person, which is going to become a medical question of relevance, surely. How does the CTCCS operate? So we had a lot of conversations between myself and the senior clinician and Mike Nelson of the CT Police about exactly how they do this work. There are many stages to this. We went into increasing detail. It starts off with the fact that they work in the same office and they will have a corridor conversation about a case that concerns them. And the clinician will either say, that could sound like a mental illness, send it through to us, or at that point, no, that doesn't sound like a mental illness. It's not relevant for us. So it starts with a corridor conversation. If they want the case to come to them as a formal referral, then the police officer will submit the information. At that point, a vast amount of information in police databases comes across to these medics sitting in the counterterrorism policing headquarters. It's too long to list here, but it's in the report. At that point, before they go to the NHS, they will apply a medical technique called formulation. This is where things become a little strange. I'll detail formulation in a moment, but effectively it's making a medical assessment that a psychiatrist or a psychologist is trained to do. However, they have not met the person and they are acting solely on the information in police databases. They make an initial picture. I'll show you how in a second. And if at that point they're still concerned, the next stage in the process is that they want to go to the NHS to say, what conditions does this person have? Are they currently in touch with treatment? To do this, they need a form of words to unlock consent and compliance from the NHS. A form of words is a really specific national security thing. It is information that comes from the covert sphere, that could come from MI5 surveillance. It could come from counterterrorism information. It could be open source, such as what someone's been posting on their Facebook. But at that point, they'll turn it into a form of words that the clinician, not the police officer, will phone the GP, will phone the psychologist and say, here is the justification for why counterterrorism policing need this individual's medical information. It is a legal way of making a public interest justification to share that secret information. If the NHS complies, and that's an if, because sometimes apparently GPs turn around and say, absolutely not. But if the person does share the information, then the formulation, the narrative is updated. What is formulation? So that is effectively the picture in the report and the picture in the Freedom of Information requests from CT policing of what they use as formulation. It's based on 5 Ps, and it's where their clinicians look at someone's data from the police records and then also from the NHS records, if information has been shared, and they break it down into the presenting problem, the precipitating factors, perpetuating factors, protective factors, and predisposing factors. And in the report, we go through a couple of examples of this. They never meet the person. It's really important to stress that. And I'll get to the next slide now, because this is actually a problem. Since 1983, the World Psychiatric Authority has had guidance that says you must not use your psychiatric training for any other purpose than health and improving someone's health. Cannot use it for political purposes or for helping the intelligence agencies. And that's been worldwide guidance for the profession since 1983. And you see this reflected in some much more modern guidance from the British Psychological Society on the best practice use of formulation. Formulation is effectively building a narrative with somebody that you are in a caring relationship with about how their condition manifests, the problems that it's causing for them, and what they can do to try and avoid those problems. So it's a narrative that is co-produced in a caring relationship. It is certainly not done at a distance without meeting the person by people working for the police. I can't stress this enough. The psychological guidance says that that cannot be done. I cannot stress that enough. It's a medical technique. It should rely on consent. There is no way that the psychological society would accept it being done without consent. It's absolutely central. And it's a co-created narrative. And yet the CTCSS are doing it at a distance in counterterrorism policing for a policing purpose, having never met the person, let alone co-produce the narrative with them. So this is a problem. Heading towards the end now, I've explained why I think counterterrorism policing are doing this. It's the result of their internal reviews and the fact that they have reached the limit of who they can follow around 24 hours a day and do proper covert surveillance on. So they've turned to health and social care. But why are the NHS doing this? Why are they cooperating with this? So 3 NHS trusts have participated in this government tender to run this service nationally. But when I say nationally, I mean England and Wales. Scotland does not participate, which is interesting. And as for why the NHS collaborates, I'm really not sure, because their primary principle is that person-centered care should dominate everything they do, which revolves around consent and building an agreement with the person as to how their treatment will progress and what will happen. There's certainly no consent here with this information sharing. And it does actually get a little bit worse in that there's a thing called tripwires that's part of the CTCCS, which is they may have a concern about you. They may go to the NHS and find that, okay, you do have a diagnosis, but you're taking medication and you're meeting your counsellor. Okay. So they're reasonably happy at that point that you don't pose any sort of uncertainty for them, but they do want to know if anything changes, and they refer to this as tripwires. What this is they make an agreement with the counsellor, with the GP. Should you stop taking your medication, stop showing up for your appointments, that they will contact them. So there's no direct access to your treatment records, but there is an agreement that continued communication can occur. This is very frightening. This is the direct enrollment of NHS frontline professionals in continued communication with counter-terrorism policing. This is called the tripwire. That honestly concerns me quite a lot. It introduces a problem as well, because you have a right to discontinue treatments. You know, if you don't like the medication you're prescribed, the state cannot force you to take it unless you are sectioned and taken to hospital. But that aside, you have the right to not take your medication. However, this tripwire introduces a consequence. If you're in one of these relationships that you don't know about, where your healthcare provider is communicating with counter-terrorism policing, there will be a consequence if you discontinue your medication. That communication will happen without you knowing. And then other consequences could come into play. So there is a question here of your right to discontinue treatment. Is this legal? Probably. It's not ethical, but it's probably legal. It's been designed very carefully to fit into the loopholes in information sharing guidance. So there is an information sharing agreement between the counter-terrorism police and the NHS. They do pay very strict attention to the Data Protection Act and GDPR, and they've put in place a set of measures to make sure that proportionality of information sharing is respected. So their example is the clinicians will get the information from the NHS, but if the NHS has done a data dump and included your previous addresses, the clinicians will filter that out and not pass it to the police. So there's a performance here of proportionality under the law. My question here is that for all other forms of information sharing with the intelligence services and the police, there is independent oversight to make sure that the person making a public interest justification, that it's robust and that it's legally viable, and that this is not just happening all the time for no reason in the pre-crime space. So I do have, as you can imagine, some concerns. There have been some safeguards put in place. There is a police officer attached to each pod, and this police officer will effectively, in the FOI releases, push back against colleagues who are fishing for information. So there are some, they found when trialing this system, there are some police who would go to the clinicians just to try and find information about addresses that they need to pursue an investigation. And it's nothing to do with mental illness. So there is a police officer put with the pod to try and stop that and to push back. Okay. However, Parliament does not know about the CTCCS. It's never been through Parliament. Home secretaries probably did know under the previous governments, but Parliament certainly does not know. The independent reviewer of terrorism legislation does know, but only because I told him and took him through the program. So there's no oversight. There's no regulator that looks at the transfer of information between the NHS and the CTCCS. And Parliament hasn't had a say in this. So this is very much a covert system that is being brought to light here. Now, earlier I told you we'd looked at all European countries. So does any other country in the world operate a system like the CTCCS? Well, we've checked, and the answer is no. They don't. Primarily because why would medical information really be of any use to an intelligence agent? It's just not that useful. So most countries have not followed this path. England and Wales are quite idiosyncratic in this regard. The closest thing that we could find is that Norway and France can share information on hospital releases, we mean psychiatric hospitals here, with intelligence and security agencies. So when a person is released, there is a notification person X is now back in the community. This is really different, probably still not ethically okay, but it's really different to the CTCCS. There's no content of what the diagnosis is, and there's also no formulation of this person's triggers are this person's protective factors are this. So it's a very different level of information sharing, but that is the closest that we could find in any other country. Recommendations to conclude. So the law does require medics to share information with police when it will prevent serious crime. And this is how the CTCCS frames itself. But is it professionally appropriate for mental health professionals to be conducting formulations for police and contributing indirectly to the management of counter-terrorism policing cases? There's sharing information, and then there's using a medical technique for the police to inform how they manage somebody. Those are different things, I would argue. This also goes significantly beyond the good practice guidance produced by the medical professional associations about formulation and about the sharing of information. So the report concludes that there are many forms of information sharing with counterterrorism police and MI5, but they tend to have regulators who approve the need, the public interest in sharing that information. There aren't any with the CTCCS. The clinicians are trusted to do that role, but they are employed by the program. So the very minimum, there needs to be independent oversight, like there is with your phone data, for example. Someone has to sit there independently and approve that there's probably a chance that you're planning something very bad or have committed a crime before they will allow the police to have your phone information. Something at the very least similar needs to be in place for your medical information. There needs to be a parliamentary knowledge and review of this program, we argue. There also needs to be a review of the effect of what happens when you tell a GP that there's a national security concern around their patient. What happens if you tell a psychologist and you're representing counterterrorism police and you tell them there's a national security concern? Their treatment regime will change. The doctor will see them differently, and there's a chance that that doctor-patient relationship will be affected. So that needs to be considered by the various professional associations here and in review of this program. The GMC and the Royal Society and the British Psychological Society should really have a look at the application of formulation here. It's a medical technique. It's supposed to be used for medical purposes only, not policing purposes. So that needs to be reviewed. And there needs to be review of the NHS's commitment to patient-centered care and whether it's appropriate for the NHS to be collaborating with this program, because there is no consent here. Tripwires in particular should be reviewed and I think abolished. So if you have any questions and for any reason you don't want to ask them in public or you don't get a chance, this is my email address. People online, you're very welcome. If you want to email me directly, go ahead. I will get back to you within the next couple of days. And that's the end of the presentation. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. I'm going to invite all of our speakers to come join us on stage now for our panel discussion. Yeah, we should have enough seats. Thank you so much for that presentation. I feel like it was a really comprehensive, clear outline of how CTCSS came to be, the kind of like defining logics that enabled it to be produced, the issues, the core issues with it, and then, yeah, also what we, from the health perspective and the medical community perspective, are like most concerned about. Yeah, so it's really great to have here alongside all of our speakers. I'll start off with the first question to kind of like allow connections to be made between this new report on CTCSS, but also like all of your work. So, and it's a bit of an entangled one, but what connections do you see between programs such as CTCSS and, you know, programs like Prevent, other pre-crime policing programs that you may have encountered, or practices of surveillance in similar ways as well that are harmful to patients, communities at large? Yeah, so like maybe connecting back to your own work or practice in some way. Maybe I'll start with you, Tarek, because we've just heard from Charlotte quite a bit.
I think, first of all, I just want to thank Medact for hosting this, particularly Charlotte for writing, I think, what should be an absolutely catastrophic sort of revelation, I think, in the side disciplines in general. You know, just to be very clear, and I know Charlotte has written about this in the past, but there's a lot of discussions usually in the side disciplines when it comes to the merging of politics and statecraft with psychology and psychiatry. And people always talk about the Soviet Union and other examples, and that's often the one that we hear about in universities. But Charlotte has effectively really demonstrated the evolution of that in our current context. And I think when we think about it with regards to broader pre-crime or the impact of how these strategies and these policies have on communities, I think of a client I had many years ago, a mother whose child was referred to Prevent. And you kind of almost alluded to her scenario. She was sitting with me, and I need to also just kind of highlight the violence of Prevent referrals. I think we tend to just kind of speak about them in cases like this where we just kind of say a Prevent referral has occurred. And of course, we don't usually have time to unpack the nuance of actually, for people who become aware that their information was passed on to the police without their consent for almost the absolutely ridiculous reasons that they can come up with. So she's shaking. I mean, literally, she's sitting in front of me. She's shaking. The violence of it is incredible. It's embodied. Yeah. And she was narrating to me a story that was very impactful for her. And that was, she was sitting with her GP. And her GP had noticed that she's been flagged somehow. Now, I'm not so sure exactly how that's occurred, but somehow that Prevent flag has showed up on her system for her for her son's referral to Prevent. And to be clear, people get referred. I'm sure Leila is going to speak about this much more, but just assume that her son was referred for something related to Palestine. And now suddenly she's sitting with her GP, and she is being told and informed by her GP that, hey, I see that you've been flagged by Prevent. And the consequence of this is far more impactful than anyone can really fully appreciate. It's one thing to have this, when we talk about racism, we often think about this interpersonal experience of discrimination, right? Someone in front of you being verbal or physically abusive in some way, shape, or form. But when it comes from an institution that has that legitimacy from the state, suddenly the breach of trust is holistic, so much so it actually breaches trust for all institutions, not only the GP, but then also the NHS, and then also schools, right? The breach of trust in this, and the impact of that is really holistic. So I'll just stop speaking right now, but I just really wanted to highlight the violence of it, because I think we don't often give it the weight that it deserves of how incredible these referrals are. Sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you. Echo the thanks. It's really interesting to listen to your presentation. So Amnesty's contribution to this space, in November 2023, we released a report. This is the Thought Police Prevent Duty and its chilling effect on human rights. And what our research showed is that the Prevent violates some of the most fundamental rights of people. And just to reiterate some of those kind of life-changing impacts that it can have, and we found that there was kind of led to a significant loss of trust in state institutions, like a massive amount of stress and anxiety and other mental health consequences, unmanageable financial costs, and significant concerns over privacy and data protection, and significant lack of access to redress and poor transparency. I mean, something that we've looked at since the publication of our report is the fact that the Prevent duty has expanded, and that's something we're looking at. And there is increasing use or sharing of data across the public sector. For example, in the Home Office, when it comes to restricting the rights of protests, and something that our report focuses on fundamentally is the disproportionate impact of Prevent on the most vulnerable and marginalized people and marginalized communities, including Muslim communities, children, and neurodiverse individuals.
Yeah, go for it. Assuming that'll work. Okay. Yeah, so thank you. And thank you to Charlotte for filling in a huge gap by exposing the CTCSS. At Prevent Watch, we've dealt with hundreds of people who have come to us and told us about their Prevent referrals or even the threats of a Prevent referral. So we always knew there was a flow of information from the person making the Prevent referral to Prevent. We didn't realize, even though we had a couple of cases, and I'll give those two cases that come to mind straight away, of examples where the information was going back in the other direction. We thought it was a one-way flow of information, and these odd cases, we couldn't quite figure out why there was information going the other way. So a very recent one is the example of a teenage boy who lives somewhere outside London. So it's not like he has a GP, like a dime a dozen. And the GP contacts the parents and says, can you come in for an appointment? Because we've been told that Prevent, and I'll just, reinforce what Tarek said. It's not just Prevent, it's counter-terrorism, right? So you're not just thinking, oh, Prevent have flagged me. It's counter-terrorism has flagged me. Because Prevent have told us about this referral of your son. And the parents were completely shocked because they didn't realize that the counterterrorism officers would go to the GP and speak to the GP and ask if there was anything on the medical records that were of concern. Now, this particular GP didn't share the records. They said, well, there's nothing of interest to you. But just knowing that, as a GP, knowing that counterterrorism officers might be interested in your client plants that seed that maybe there's something there, because why else would they be contacting, right? You assume that they have this wealth of information in the background, this secretive information they cannot share with you. And so there must be something there. There's no smoke without fire. And this happened actually in a few years back. There was a lady who her 4-year-old was referred to Prevent. And she went through a very traumatic experience. I think you're aware, Tariq. It might even be a similar individual that you were speaking about. But she was so traumatized for almost an hour. She had 2 Prevent officers banging at her door and a social worker. And I don't often meet my clients face to face because a lot of what we do is via our helpline, and we can offer that support via the helpline. But I went to the home of this particular individual, and it's a completely quiet street. So knowing that somebody, 2 people, in fact, with a social worker, were banging on her door for over 45 minutes, saying that if she doesn't let them in for a chat, they will bring armed police to break the door down. This is Prevent. This is voluntary, right? It's pre-crime. There's nothing, you've not even been suspected of a crime yet. And what she found out was that the information had been shared with her GP about something that had happened to her child. Remember, it's a 4-year-old who's been referred to Prevent a few months, when the child was a few months old, right? So they were talking to her saying, so when the child was a few months old, this had happened. That was so traumatic that 4 years later, okay, I got a call from this client when she had another baby by then. Her baby was in the ICU, was in the intensive care unit. Their organs were shutting down and the doctors didn't actually know what was happening. And they offered a genetic screening. And they said, if you and your husband give us your DNA, we can do a full genetic. They had no idea what was happening. And so they offered this, and they don't offer genetic screening to anyone, right? And she called me at that point. Why? Because she's thinking, do they really want my DNA for my child's benefit? Or do they want my DNA to put it on the system because they've been surveilling me for this long? And only after the incident did she then call back up, and she was so angry. She was like, I can't believe that at that moment, that's what I was thinking in my mind. So these things are so long lasting. I think that's definitely where we see it. And like I said, this 2-way flow of information is really very interesting, but it closes a lot of gaps that we previously had ourselves.
Thanks so much all for those like immediate reflections. Yeah, I'm hearing a lot about the kind of like reality of the impact of a Prevent referral or being made aware that your data has been shared with CTCSS, like the ways in which the knowledge of the state having access to your data and information dramatically changes your interaction and trust and engagement with state institutions. And that makes me think about the securitization of health, as we call it, as this bi-directional thing that you've named, is not just that we're, the Prevent duty is rolled out into health spaces and rolled out into the communities, but also, as we've seen from this presentation, there's a recruitment, there's an intentional kind of like taking of health workers, taking of people who are supposed to be public sector workers and, carry out education, healthcare, into those state institutions. And why is that? I think, it's just really clarifying to hear, and also to like kind of comprehend what that does when you have a state that is embedding surveillance into everyday life in those ways. The second question I had was around kind of healthcare specifically and the co-option of healthcare. And I guess panelists might have thoughts on the kind of role of the health worker, why this like very intentional taking of the healthcare worker into counter-terrorism policing, into these practices of surveillance, is a technique and a tactic and a tool that the state uses. Like, what is it about the role of the health worker that enables this to happen? Big question.
I'll be extremely brief because I'm sitting next to probably the world expert on this, and Tariq will just give an amazing answer. Speaking to the people running this particular program, I did wonder sometimes if they believe something about health's power, especially mental health power, to reform a person, to change a person, to save a person. I got that vibe a lot when working on this that mental health care in particular was held up by the security services as a way, a really special sector that had special powers that could reform people and stop them going down this route where then the police would have to later become involved. And increasingly speaking to medics and speaking to psychologists and psychiatrists, they've often found this quite laughable in that they don't have these powers at all. There is a highlighting of mental health care as somehow able to reform and save the person, and I think this is why the state has turned to mental health care in this way. But Tarek will be fabulous on this question, so I will pass over.
Even just sorry, before I hand over to Tarek, what you said just made me think about like the individualization of like mental health, of being like, oh, well, you know, mental health concerns are located in the body as one specific site, and people are individuals with a problem that can provide us with data about what their future actions will be, rather than pointing to the larger structures that have produced the conditions that mean they live in a world wherein, you know, they're confronted with so many problems on a day-to-day basis. It's a real reflection, I think, of, you know, how the state sees mental health, which is not something that is, you know, informed by state failure, which obviously it is. But sorry, Tarek, go on.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm definitely not the world expert on this. Certainly a student among many. I mean, this is something that I take as a subject very seriously, and it's very important to me to educate the public about the historic role of psychology and psychiatry in statecraft. I think, you know, we might see this right now as something exceptional, but actually, you know, the institution of psychology, the language of mental health has long played a role in statecraft when it comes to issues of poverty, for example, right? I mean, we can always diagnose people for being anxious and depressed, for being economically marginalized. But if you know, if we want to actually make a change, it's not actually in the minds of the people, right? And I think this is something that's been widely recognized as one of the most functional utilities of healthcare, psychology and psychiatry in particular, as this process of being able to individualize issues and therefore make it possible to manage, right? There's an element of management here that is really significant when it comes to the side disciplines. I mean, I think really, I just want to say shame on every single psychologist, psychiatrist that's involved in this. You know, I mean, despite obviously the history of psychology and mental health professionals sort of being involved in this, you know, I think there's always been this counter discourse that no, the therapeutic space has to be sacred, has to be sanctified. Confidentiality and anonymity is like, it's not even like a key, it's a foundational ingredient to therapy. You can't actually have a therapeutic alliance when you know that the state is watching, if police are watching, or, you know, my parents are watching, or anybody else is watching. It's something that's widely understood. And you know, you can see that all of this is completely thrown, you know, it's just thrown out the window. I was just thinking, actually, it just came to my mind right now. I'll just end with this example. In Germany, there's a therapeutic service for pedophilia. And, you know, as much as we can hate it in our hearts, we can understand the need potentially for a service for people who have these thoughts and experiences, to be able to go seek and speak to someone for support. And one of the main sort of anchors of this service in its presentation publicly is to absolutely be adamant that this is, you know, this has nothing to do with policing, right? And they have to be able to maintain that, because otherwise people won't go seek support, right? If people can't seek support, then they'll be left on their own. And so it's quite ironic, even just from the logics of whatever counter-terrorists or counterterrorism experts think this is going to achieve. Because ultimately, if they actually believe these people to have mental health issues and that they need support for it, then it would be the opposite that's needed. It would be support services that are absolutely confidential and anonymous, where people can go and share their thoughts and concerns. Which I think I'll just mention, speaking on behalf of Healing Justice London, who I'm representing today, you know, this is also speaks to the need for us as a community to develop transformative healthcare structures, you know, places that are safe and secure for people who have these issues, for people who have concerns, to be able to actually seek confidential spaces.
Yeah, I think in terms of key dangers, I think there's something there to be said about the blurring, increasingly the blurring of the line between surveillance and policing and safeguarding. And that's one of the key concerns that we identified. That also massively means that efforts by individuals and institutions to comply with PREVENT are leading to kind of mass violations of people's rights that is disproportionate. And is not even an effective use of resources. And I think there is something to be said about how better these resources can be used. So our position is that because of the massive kind of effect on the violations of human rights and the disproportionate intervention on the rights of the individual, that PREVENT should be scrapped. But there is another question there, that how else can these resources be used to better safeguard individuals?
I think just one thought in terms of how the healthcare sector is quite unique. I think if you think about it in terms of thresholds, and I think if you look at all the other sectors, actually the healthcare sector has quite high thresholds that you need to overcome in order to achieve a program like this, right? In order to achieve the CTCSS. So if you think about being arrested, or maybe don't think about being arrested, but think about all the shows that you've watched, or maybe have been arrested or have seen someone being arrested, the first thing they say is they caution you, right? Or they read you your rights. In America, it's like, what's it? You have the right to remain silent, right? In the UK, it's you do not have to say anything. Same principle. You don't have to share that information. There's no flow of information. You have a safeguard there, and that safeguard is a very old safeguard, and it's there to do exactly that, to safeguard that interaction of information. Now, that is if you're being arrested on suspicion of a crime. You might not have committed the crime, but the point is there is suspicion of an offense. In the pre-crime space, there is no suspicion of an offense. And yet that same safeguard isn't there, because there is a flow of information, whether you know it or not. In fact, the fact that you don't know it is even more dangerous, right? That flow of information is occurring. And that flow of information occurring in the healthcare sector means that you've managed to, as Charlotte was describing, you know, they've paid special attention to all the loopholes, to the GDPR, to the Data Protection Act. And if they've been able to overcome it in the healthcare sector, then it's easy to do it in all the other sectors too. And so I think one of the key reasons that it's in the healthcare sector, for all the reasons you've mentioned as well, is because it is really a gateway then to everywhere else. And we've seen that with PREVENT, and we've seen that with all other surveillance measures.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I really echo that. I have a couple more questions, but I'm taking the point as well, just to remind everyone, if you do have questions, to jot them down, because there will be time for questions at the end. Similarly to people online, please drop them in the chat if you have any as we go through the discussion. But the next question I had was kind of building on what we've spoken about in relation to the pre-crime space. So in my own notes, I've written down, you know, we're seeing the widening of the pre-crime space by government, alongside a rollback of freedom of expression, dissent, the right to protest. And, you know, alongside of this rollback in rights, we're also seeing the expansion of definitions of extremism. So the widening of that pre-crime space comes alongside like a real attempt to criminalize thought, essentially, political positions, and even to the point of like expanding the definition of extremism accordingly. So like a culture and a practice of surveillance is being rolled out across the public sector, like we've named already. And I wonder if the panelists could respond to this question of how do you see the expansion of pre-crime policing, counter-terrorist surveillance, practices like CTCSS, impacting our communities and bolstering the state? Because obviously these many different kind of areas of encroachment on our rights ultimately accumulate into an environment, a culture where people don't feel confident or comfortable expressing themselves, expressing political disagreement with the dominant narratives, and also then are being monitored for those particular political beliefs also. So like, what do you see, the impact of that on community and like our broader society?
Yeah, I think the other speakers will be fantastic on many aspects of this question. So I'm just going to take one aspect of it, which is during the research, how shocking it was early in the research, submitting FOI requests. There was a wonderful day when, you know, when you get an FOI response, most of it is redacted and you're thinking, okay, there's a lot here, but I really would like to know what is under the redacted sections. Well, one day I was in a very boring work meeting and I realized that the report had been very badly redacted that had come from Counter Terrorism Policing. And Open Rights Group had the same FOI response. And we found out that we could copy paste behind the redaction and move it to a Word document. And this is when we became aware that there wasn't one pre-crime program. There's actually a few. And so the expansion of this space, as someone who's worked on studying Prevent for a long time, was quite a shock to me that there's actually not one. And suddenly the previous Medact report, something that I always had never been able to work out, made sense to me, which is that previously one of the vulnerability support hubs had just looked at all Prevent referrals in the Midlands. This was the Birmingham hub. And yet we were looking at numbers in the hundreds for several years. And we just couldn't understand that. And I remember we were just sitting there going, well, we're going to have to move forward. The maths doesn't make any sense, but we've got the evidence. We're just going to have to move forward. And it was this several years later when we realized, oh my God, it's not multi-agency Prevent. It's what is now called police-led partnerships, PLP. It's the covert Prevent. It's in the hundreds rather than the 7,000s. This makes sense. So yeah, I think something I always try and leave audiences with is to think the Prevent you know about is the tip of the iceberg. Let's take the iceberg metaphor back from Prevent, right? So they say, you know, what you can see of terrorism is just a bit above the water, and then they draw you this triangle of all the stages beneath that lead there. Well, that's the same with what we know about the pre-crime programs that are currently operating in the UK. We can see Prevent, it's the bit sticking out the top. Underneath it, there's PLP, there's multi-agency centre. There's a few of these that intersect with each other that are run completely in the covert space. Some of them deal with people who've been under investigation, may not have committed a crime, and some of them are purely pre-crime. And so I'd like to, take back the iceberg metaphor, and I'll stop there.
I'm happy to after Leila.
Yeah, so I think this idea of the pre-crime space has become very normalized. And that's part of the problem, is that a lot of people speak about extremism, radicalization, like it's everyday language, safeguarding as well, which is being co-opted, might as well be synonymous with, dealing with radicalization. And that language and that normalization of the language, I think has allowed it to expand. I think there are currently responses to thought crimes or thought non-crimes, pre-crimes. In fact, I think we're going to replace the P of pre-crime and just say psychic. I know it doesn't really work phonetically, but it's the psychic space, right? It's psychic policing. It's not really pre-crime policing. I think the language in and of itself makes it out as if they're doing something before a crime. And a lot of people actually believe that. And actually, if you look at a lot of media reports, they will say, counter-terrorism police unfoiled a plot. And then they'll speak about Prevent. It's like, what has Prevent got to do with unfoiling a plot? There's a plot. There's a plan. That's got nothing to do with prevent. It's not in the prevent space. And the fact that that conflation occurs in pretty much most articles that you will see is very, very unhelpful. And that normalization is deliberate. It's the way to get everybody to surveil, right? Everyone understands, even if you can't define what extremism is, everyone knows what extremism is, right? And that allows for programs like this to take place. If you look at the proportional response to terrorism, actually, this isn't a proportional response to terrorism because there aren't that many terrorists and that many terror offenses. And in fact, I say terror offenses. What is a terror offense today was not a terror offense 5 years ago, and specifically 5 years ago, because in 2019, those thresholds were lowered. And this comes back to the idea of thresholds. The threshold of what constitutes a terror offense today is much lower. And this is why we see so many children being convicted for terror offenses. It's not because all of a sudden our kids have turned into little terrorists running around and we need to refer them. No, it's because now they have to just click one thing one time, and that's a terror offense. And yet these statistics will be used to justify that response. And it's just this vicious cycle that we see. It's self-perpetuating. You see the numbers. Okay, more kids are going and being accused and convicted of terror offenses. And therefore, we have to have this. We have to have this in education. We have to have it in healthcare. So I think it's a very dangerous space. And we need to really take back the language and remove that normalization because it's very far from normal.
So I mean, talking about the extremism definition, so these are kind of developments that have happened given the political context predominantly this year, following October the 7th. But even before that, looking at from our report, Amnesty's report, one of the points that we identified was the chilling effect of prevent, the fact that individuals are self-censoring and changing their behavior in fear of referrals. So I think on one bit of research, 109 out of 153 respondents, Muslim respondents, said that they had modified their behavior for due to concerns around prevent. And I mentioned the kind of racist and discriminatory impact of prevent. And again, this is pre the expansions that we're talking about this year. Prevent is 8 times more likely to impact Muslim communities, 4 times more likely to impact Asian communities. Again, look at the statistics in terms of children. 29% of referrals approximately impact, we're talking about under 15-year-olds. Figures from 2014 to 2016, 39% of referrals were kind of Muslim children. So these were already huge concerns that we had around prevent. So now look at the political context of this year, where there has been a deliberate attempt to broaden the use of prevent. And we've already mentioned, so in the healthcare sector, we're concerned in terms of kind of information sharing and the use of prevent in the immigration context. So there are kind of cases ongoing where individuals who have been involved in Gaza protests have had deportation orders issued. So that's something that we're tracking. And the very broadening definition of extremism links to that. So there was a very concerning speech in March where the then Prime Minister said that we need to redouble our support for prevent to kind of protect young minds from being poisoned. So I think the hope is, and one of the things that we'll be working on is to pressure the new government to kind of drop that broad non-statutory definition, which again, for the most part, it must be quite confusing for the public sector. So it's not in statute yet. You're going to have public bodies responding to it. So I think a lot has, I guess we have to wait and see to some extent with the new government, whether these kind of measures will be taken forward or not. But there's definitely been an expansion post our report and kind of from February onwards this year.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to maybe highlight 2 very quick things. I think there's also these internal tensions within prevent, within counter-extremism circles, and obviously the industry. We never use the word industry, but there's a lot of money in all of this. But I think some of the tensions we see obviously is how much prevent and extremism should be rendered colorblind and going and expansive towards a lot of different issues and concerns and I think there were also articles being made about bringing in misogyny, Andrew Tate, things like that. And then there's a sort of counter discourse of, no, it really has to be about Muslims and everything else is superfluous. So I think, you know, I think it's very important to, first of all, speak out against the expansive discourse. I think people find, personally, I think, comfort in hoping that Prevent can be re-instrumentalized to go after white people, the far right, other things, but that's not how it works by design, right? And I think it's very important to acknowledge that colorblindness is a significant vehicle in modern forms of racism, right? So rendering a racist policy colorblind does not actually address the racism of the policy. I also just maybe want to just add, I think, to Leila's point, also about language, but I think also just the idea below the language is, I always come back to this quote that the future is colonized by risk, right? So a lot of these policies about pre-crime all kind of revolve around this idea of the future always being under threat. And then policies and institutions, and not only obviously when it comes to Prevent, we think about gang matrix, we think about so many different, you know, border policing, a lot of things kind of revolve around this idea that I think we have to actually actively name it and then counteract it. And one of the main elements of counteracting this is also trust, is that we have to really reinforce the idea that our only way of moving forward is actually trust. It's not about increased surveillance or having this risk-based logic.
Yeah, really, really agree with that. And thank you all for really fantastic reflections on that question. We're coming up, we've only got like 12 more minutes left. And my last question, I think, folds into a question that someone in the chat actually asked. So that transitions us nicely into the audience Q&A. But this question was, how do you think we can work to challenge these practices that fall under the umbrella of, quote unquote, this securitization of healthcare? So like, how can we develop strategies towards, you know, challenging the policies that we've named in this conversation, but also the culture and narratives that make them possible? And similarly, Asma asked, so practically, are there any groups organizing against these actions? Similarly, what does an effective challenge or opposition to this particular program looks like from our communities as well, not just from, you know, campaigners or academics, etc. So yeah, if you have thoughts and reflections on strategies for resistance, that would be a good place to come towards closing. Yeah.
I'm going to be useless on this question. As a political scientist working in the academy, I get drawn into the really reductive space of transparency. And I think I will be heading in that direction in the future with my research, sort of what is transparency? And it's becoming very, very clear through the research on the CTCSS that transparency is not going to save us. Transparency is, it is how power actually works rather than being a safeguard against power. And so I get drawn into these conversations of sort of legality when discussing this program with the elite and trying to bring it to the attention of Parliament, as if that making it transparent and having oversight is going to solve the problem. That might be all that the institutions can provide us with in terms of, well, the policy is here now, it's up and running, it doesn't go back in the genie lamp, you know, it's out here. We can provide oversight, we can at least monitor its operations, but that is all that I think that the institutions can really offer. And actually that's a real problem. Transparency here is allowing these programs to do what they do. It's not a solution, and it's actually how power and rules work in modern society. So my reflection is only that I hope someone else has a better answer, because the conversations that I'm being drawn into with the state are very, very limited, and just, yeah, seeing what is being done and someone having oversight is no solution to this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to keep it short. I'll just want to mention that I just sort of in continuation to what Charlotte is saying, I think the state often wants us to improve on these policies piecemeal, right? So how can we make it better? How can we make it less racist? I've been personally asked in that regard, with regards to prevent, so I think there's something about, first of all, recognizing the inherent violence of these policies as a whole. And obviously, I think what Charlotte did really well is actually document all the various ways it actually contravenes everything that healthcare stands for in the first place, right? So there's no way of actually making it better piecemeal. But I just wanted to add just a further reflection. I think we also have to further acknowledge the wider structures of policing and security in healthcare in general, right? And that we're thinking about many other structures that are involved. Medact published a report on SIMS, whereby police become the first sort of responders to people in distress. There's actually a lot of additional layers of surveillance, security, and policing in healthcare that's been growing over many years. And that speaks to the wider expansion of policing. Also, obviously, hostile environment. We're speaking about border policing within healthcare. There's so many things. And I think it's not about just looking at one, but I think for us as a community, what we need to do, especially, is develop that solidarity among many different movements, many different issues regarding policing and state security in healthcare. And obviously, far more broadly, learning from abolitionist movements and others, how we can develop community-based, really grassroots alternative structures towards our collective healthcare.
I mean, the states have to combat terrorism-related acts, right? But any restrictions on human rights for national security reasons must be provided by law, must be necessary, and must be proportionate. And that doesn't even touch on the fact that prevent isn't even effective by its own standards and measures. And that's why for Amnesty, given the violations we documented in our research, we led us to the stark conclusion that the UK must scrap the prevent strategy in order to comply with its international human rights standards. So our position is that the strategy as a whole should be withdrawn, and we should rely on pre-existing safeguarding procedures to revert individuals that are at risk of harm. And linking in with what I mentioned before, we need to kind of refrain from using overly broad definitions of extremism and avoid kind of blurring that line between surveillance and safeguarding. And specifically related to prevent as well, refrain from the attempts to delegitimize criticism that's made by journalists, made by academics, teachers, and civil society as a whole. Like, those are individuals and groups that we must protect, which is why it's so important we kind of come together and support each other and have these discussions as a whole. And in particularly, we spoke about the disproportionate impact on vulnerable communities and children in particular. I think it is important to establish alternative measures so children who are vulnerable and not exposed to the criminal justice system, which these measures do tend to do.
I'm going to very controversially suggest that we take up one of William Shawcross's recommendations, which is to dispel misinformation. He suggested that, misinformation be dispelled. I absolutely agree. And I think that is down to us. So when we see things being normalized, when we see prevent and other such pre-crime measures being written about in a way that just simply isn't true and places them in a different category to make it seem like you're not dealing with innocent children most of the time, that you're not dealing with people who are going to their doctor for support and care and are instead being surveilled, we need to dispel that. And I think everyone can do that. I mean, everyone does it on social media. Everyone has, a million comments under a video about someone making lunch for their child. So I don't understand why we can't do a similar approach, and why everyone, again, taking from, you know, it's everyone's responsibility to counter terrorism. Well, it's everyone's responsibility, I think, to dispel that misinformation. The second approach, I think, again, taking inspiration from Prevent, is the multi-agency panels. And I think that network, we have our networks, we have different organizations, and everyone has their specific objectives in mind, but ultimately we do have a common thread, which is that none of us agree with these types of approaches. And I think a lot of organizations have come together and have been speaking about ways to challenge Prevent. And it has been happening for over a decade. You know, slowly, if you think of Prevent as a tree, those branches have come down to a point where they have had to change tactics in terms of how they approach it, because they realize just how toxic it is, just how much it's failed, and all the things they need to do to overcome that. And just lastly, I think, you know, going back to what Charlotte said at the beginning, why was this even invented in the first place? Well, they didn't have any more capacity, and they needed to lean in on the public sectors. They needed to lean in on the healthcare sector. And so it really comes down to all of the people upon whom are being relied to carry this out, to use their professional moral judgment and to just hold off. I mean, I saw in the report that some people were coming back with responses and saying, well, actually, I'm not going to give you that information. Can you put it in writing? Can you send it to the designated person, and just understand the different pathways that your particular sector might have to afford those safeguards, and to start putting those safeguards back into place when it comes to data protection of people.
Yeah, definitely. I think like that speaks to a point around non-compliance. That is also a really useful strategy that we have, especially like as people employed in these sectors that are being co-opted. I just want to also say, in response to the strategizing/organizing question Asma had, I think that supporting the work of Prevent Watch, who are organizations supporting people who have had a Prevent referral, supporting like organizing spaces like at Medact, we have the Securitization of Health group who are working to campaign against Prevent. Similarly, Amnesty, I know, have anti-racist campaign groups who are taking action on Prevent as their priority campaign. So I feel like a lot of the speakers of the organizations represented here are good points of contact to start organizing. Maybe we'll take one question from the audience before we close, if anyone does have a question or reflection or something that you'd like some of the speakers to respond to, because we have 2 minutes left, and I'm told we do have a roaming mic. Thank you, TJ. Yeah, Venetia, go.
Hi, working? Yeah. Hi, I'm Felicia. Thank you so much for the report, for the event, for the discussion so far. I am a health worker. I'm a doctor in the NHS. And I suppose my reflection, and then I have a little question at the end. My reflection is I work in sexual reproductive health, predominantly in abortion care, and that's another area that I often have reflections that, you know, there's that intersection of the law, healthcare, bodily autonomy, involvement of police increasingly we've seen over the last few years, and that flow of information between the NHS and police and people being harmed, in a nutshell. Yeah. So that's kind of my reflection, and then I'd love to, I can't remember who said it now, I think perhaps you did, about recognizing all those different areas, a lot of which Medact works on, of how that increasing securitization in that health space is happening, and sharing those experiences and being able to like learn from each other and work together. That's something I'd really like to see, which I'll maybe speak to you about later. So I'm also a member and a trustee of Reproductive Justice Initiative, formerly known as Decolonizing Contraception. So that's one thing. My second thing was just, I think you've partly answered it along the way, but is there it sounds like there's no legal obligation on GPs, NHS, etc., to share. And one of the things that the professional like abortion society tried to do is the kind of the bosses, the seniors, put on a webinar to be like, these are the ethical considerations, these are the other ways to, like, you know, basically being like, you don't have to tell people, you don't have to tell the police. So I guess my question is is there a legal obligation? I'm guessing no. Is there any case of like court orders or something being used to like press that information out of people? And is there any attempt or like maybe future work to directly address that?
I'm so glad that you've asked this question. So I'm not sure I actually quote this in the report, but it's certainly in the broader conversations with the people running the CCS. So quite a few times they would frame some problems they have with uncooperative medics. And this kind of became a discourse that would appear in very long interviews. Quite a few medics use some choice words when they get phoned up by the CTCSS, who have to say who they are when they make the request for information. There can be some rather frank language from the GP on the other end in terms of ending that conversation and not sharing information. So that can happen more frequently when they're talking about uncooperative medics. There would be the, I'm not too sure about this. Do you want to go to my Caldecott guardian, please? And just sort of saying, I'm not comfortable. I'm not going to be sharing this information. And just sort of saying, I'm not going to outright refuse, but it's certainly not my job to be evaluating this public interest justification to break confidentiality. And indeed, that is why Caldecott guardians exist, right? They are supposed to be the ones who handle the difficult public interest justification cases. That would be interesting to me if the CTCSS was forced to deal with the Caldecott guardian. How would that change things? Because at the moment, they are not going to the Caldecott guardian. They are phoning the GP and the psychologist directly. They're not going through the existing channel that exists for those kinds of conversations. So buried in GMC guidance, there is some advice to medics that sometimes you might have to share information. But there's also a strong set of advice that confidentiality is sacrosanct. I don't think it's for the medic to be making that decision. So I'd say other people in the system exist. So if you feel under pressure, don't engage. There are times, and we're talking here not in the non-crime space, we're talking about a case of really the other end of the spectrum, of which there are very few. So remember the cases of investigations and of the higher level sort of bits of the system. There was a case where they were trying to engage the NHS and they were not getting what they wanted. There is an escalation mechanism that they'll just go to the senior executives if they feel that they're being blocked. So I just feel like it's not the GP's responsibility. It's not the healthcare professional's responsibility to make what are in very, very difficult calculations. I hope that clarifies it. And, you know, certainly they deal with people who say no and who have very choice language when saying no sometimes. So yeah, embrace the difficult medic inside you is what I would end on.
It's not within the medical sector, but there was a case recently in, I think it was in December of last year. It was reported in the Middle East Eye of a teacher who he took his time. He did end up giving some information, but he took his time because he was approached for data about the children in his school. And obviously he wanted to understand what the rights were. He was barred from teaching for a couple of years. He did win his case in December against the Teaching Regulation Agency, I think it is, TRA. And so that was successful and we supported on that case. But the reason it's important is because I think we need to remember that when it comes to information about children or people who aren't an imminent threat, you can find out, you know, you can go and find out your rights and, okay, what is the protocol? You don't have to immediately play into that power dynamic of, oh, there's a counterterrorism officer here asking me a question and I have to give that information straight away. So I think people need to remember where we are on that scale in terms of any imminent threat and then take action and not to make that disempowering that he was barred for a couple of years, because I think it was very empowering, because now he is a test case going forward in terms of how police are going to deal, and they'll think twice, I guess, before they make similar kinds of consequences for other people in other sectors as well.
Go for it, Tarek.
I'll just say in one sentence, I think the other side of the coin, just from both of these inputs, is that we actually have no research at all on how many health professionals are willing to share information, right? And that's a whole other issue. We don't know how many psychologists, psychiatrists are actually very pro-policing, pro-security. The politics of generally psychologists and psychiatrists is actually something that's completely unknown to us. So that actually speaks to another point about regulatory bodies, which Charlotte brought up in the recommendations, about actually this shouldn't come down on them, not so it doesn't put pressure on them to not, if they want to disagree. Actually, we need to actually find ways of protecting patients in case the mental health professionals or others do want to join, right? Like, we actually have to have it protecting, we need protective measures on the others.
Thank you so much. Those are really important and incisive final comments. And yeah, that'll draw us to a close because it is 8:07 p.m. So I will say thank you so much to our panelists for joining, to Charlotte for writing this incredible briefing. That will be a really useful reference point for all of us going forward, and for all of you for joining in person and online as well. Really much appreciated. I think TJ has shared in the chat with people online, but if you had any further questions, please do feel free to email us. Our email is office@medact.org, and we can share that with the panelists too. You can download the report in full from our website now at medact.org/unhealthy-liaisons. And yeah, do support our work, do become a member, get involved with organizing groups within Medact's network if you can. And yeah, just email us if you have any further questions, but thank you for coming.